Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. Thanks for coming back for part 2 of my discussion with Allan Barsky about the 2018 NASW Code of Ethics. In part 1, Allan and I talked about the history of the Code of Ethics and Section 1.03i, which is electronic searches. In today's episode, part 2, we talk about Section 1.05, cultural competence, and whether online communities fall under the ethical standard of cultural competence. Now, Allan mentions the NASW 2016 standards and indicators for cultural competence. And you can find that on the NASW website. And we'll also put the link on the Social Work Podcast website. Well, right after he mentions that, I mention the 2017 standards for technology and social work practice, which you can also find on the NASW website. I mentioned that there was some feedback that both the tech standards and the 2018 Code of Ethics painted technology as problematic. Now, spoiler alert, Allan disagreed. You be the judge. We went on to talk about Section 1.04e, knowing the laws in your jurisdiction and the ones where your clients live, and how that affects practicing across state lines with or without technology. And now, without further ado, on to episode 114 of the Social Work Podcast, the 2018 NASW Code of Ethics, Part 2, an interview with Allan Barsky. I want to move on to Section 1.05, Cultural Awareness and Social Diversity. Section B says social workers should have a knowledge base of their client's culture and be able to demonstrate competence in provision of services that are sensitive to clients' cultures and to differences among people and cultural groups. And this sounds like something that social workers have been doing for a long time. And so it's not necessarily a new idea, but people have talked about participation in online communities as being cultures, as having a different set of values and rules and expectations and norms. Was there any discussion in the revision about whether or not the Code of Ethics considers online communities or technology-mediated relationships as being clients' cultures?
So in terms of what the internal discussions were, we were actually asked to sign an agreement that we would not share what those discussions were. So those are to be private, confidential discussions. What may be helpful for people is to look at there were practice standards, I think in 2016, on cultural competence. And I'm not sure if they brought up the issue about whether or not a community that is online has its own culture. But if you look at, just sort of the definition of culture, it's a group that has its own language, norms, values, etc. So certainly various groups that are communicating online have different types of cultures, what's okay and what's not okay, and many subcultures within. So you couldn't say everybody on Facebook is the same culture. There may be some attributes that are familiar or common across many Facebook users, but there's so many subgroups within Facebook as well. So, to me personally, I would say that it's you could consider various online groups and various people who are connected through different types of digital communities. It doesn't even have to be social networking, that there may be some cultural aspects. I should clarify that even though I was on the task force, I'm not a spokesperson for NASW. I'm not hired by them. I haven't been asked to speak on their behalf.
Right, which is a good clarifier, and I appreciate that.
Did you want to go back to 1.05D since we were talking about culture issues? Because that's the section that's amended.
Yes, would be happy to.
So one of the things that social workers have always been good at is doing a broad psychosocial assessment, looking at all different areas of the person's life, biologically, psychologically, socially, spiritually. We haven't always been good at assessing people in terms of their relationships with technology. And so, although this is a section on cultural awareness, competence, and technology, part of it is really just awareness that when you're doing work with people in terms of using technology, you should be aware of cultural, environmental, economic, ability, and linguistic factors that affect the use of these services. So, for example, there's a number of people who are using text-based services, and you need to have people who have a certain level of not just fluency in English or whatever language you're working in, but also a level of literacy to be able to use that technology. There's a lot of economic factors in terms of just access to different types of services. I know of entire programs that have stopped providing in-person services and everything is through technology, but that's assuming that everybody has tablets or computers, or they've got plans that allow them, large amounts of data and things like that. So we have to be aware of access issues for people on economic issues, and also in terms of ability issues. Now, sometimes when you look at the code or you look at standards, it seems to focus on, the negatives, but here it really talks about assessing all of these different factors. And it may actually be that using technology is a great way to engage people with different abilities and different economic abilities as well. So, in terms of economics, the person who is working a 9 to 5 job and can't afford to take off a couple of hours in the middle of the day might be able to connect with a social worker during lunch via technology. And so it's actually a more accessible means for the person as opposed to a less accessible means.
Well, I appreciate you clarifying sort of the tone of the code of ethics with regards to technology, because there are places in there where it sounds like the code is saying technology is bad.
Could you please point out a section where it actually says technology is bad? I think people came up with that critique, and we tried to change any of that language, because I think it's not even a choice between with technology or not with technology anymore, because there's often a blending.
Mm-hmm.
And so we heard very loudly and tried to make sure that there wasn't a statement that said technology was riskier or technology was second rate. In fact, in many cases, technology can be better. We do actually add language where people say, well, why do you have to add that language about technology? Because, shouldn't we know it anyhow? And one of the reasons that we added that language is because even though the existing standard should have covered the issue, we were finding a lot of problems with it. So, for example, in terms of use of respectful language, there's a number of places where we're talking about sexual relations or sexual harassment or respectful language, and we made sure that we clarified that it's not just orally or in writing, but it could also be digital communications, which could include sending memes or pictures or electronic videos. And people could say, well, why do you really need that? We've had a number of incidents, even on the NASW website, where people have been sending very vitriolic language and very insulting language to people that I don't think they would have said if we were having these conversations in person. So we did it to try to highlight it's really that it's an educational tool. It's not changing the nature of the obligations, but just being very clear about these types of standards. They apply whether it's with technology or without technology.
So you alluded to feedback that you received about specifically the technology practice standards. Is that correct?
Yeah, we got feedback to both the technology standards and also to the code of ethics.
Oh, okay.
Both were set up for feedback from people. And then also, I've been doing a number of presentations around the country, including some at social work and social work education conferences, and people bring up these concerns. So it's great that you can have these different dialogues with people.
Yes, that's a very strengths-based way of thinking about it. But you asked about sections where it sounded like there is an implication that technology was bad. And that's kind of very absolute language. But I want to point one out that to me speaks to that, and I would love to hear what you have to say. So under Section 1.03, informed consent, under letter G, the last sentence says, if clients do not wish to use services provided through technology, social workers should help them identify alternate methods of service. And in my mind, a more tech-friendly statement would have included a corollary, which is, and if clients do not wish to use services that are traditionally provided and would prefer technology, that social workers should help them identify those technology-mediated services. So that's what I mean by saying there are places where there is a tone that I'm reading, and I will admit my bias, that has places where it sounds like technology is the less favorable option. And so you should always be able to find them the better option, which would be the traditional services.
So one of the things that we're trying to do with the Code of Ethics is to educate people, and there's social workers with various levels of familiarity and comfort with technology. And so if you look at the entirety of informed consent, it does talk about, just in general, we should inform clients about the purposes of services, risks, etc. And clients have a right to, ask questions and either consent to or reject different types of services. So they could reject in-person services. I think you're right that we could have worded that section differently, but what was decided was to leave the rest of the standard intact and have a particular paragraph to just educate people about the use of technology. So yes, it could have talked about both directions. I'm not sure that it's saying that don't use technology because it's worse. I think it's just saying if you're using technology, make sure you assess people's ability to use it. And we do similar for whether it's technology assisted or not technology assisted in earlier parts. And I would actually
Yes.
think that, 10, 20 years from now, some of these sections on technology could probably be taken out completely because people will have, found ways to make use of technology in a way that, doesn't really separate out in-person versus technology. So for a lot of people, it still feels like it's something new or different. But as we move along, it's probably we're probably gonna incorporate things in a way that's more fluid.
Which I think is also a nice thing to keep in mind, and I appreciate you pointing out that, which is that the NASW Code of Ethics is a responsive document, right? It responds to things that change in society and the ways that the profession changed. And so I think you're right. I think it would make sense to think that in 20 years from now, some of the things that are new will be just integrated into society. I don't know exactly what those will be, but it's nice to know that that's something that we can think forward to.
We're both professors, so I don't know if you've ever looked at some of your older syllabi, and in older syllabi you sort of explain to people how to log on to Blackboard or WebCT or whatever the online type of service was. We had to provide a lot more information to students for how to
Yes.
use technology, and now there's just sort of an assumption that people know how to log on and do all of the basics, and now it's training people to do something at higher levels or newer types of technology.
Yes. No, that's a great analogy. Absolutely true. And in fact, I found one of the trainings that I did back at my old agency in 1997, and I actually defined what a mouse was.
And then probably had to put a picture of it too.
I did. I know that there's some other things in the Code of Ethics that have changed around confidentiality and boundary issues and professional responsibility. And I'm wondering if you could talk about some of those, particularly some that will change the way that social workers will think about practice or maybe practice. Could you address some of those changes?
Okay, so one change, it's only a couple of words, but they're very critical words. 1.07c when we're talking about confidentiality. So the first part of it is a statement that we're to keep information confidential except for compelling professional reasons. And then it gives some possible exceptions to those. And so the primary exception in the second sentence, keeping information confidential, does not apply when disclosure is necessary to prevent serious, foreseeable, imminent harm to a client or others. Now, it used to be serious, foreseeable, and imminent harm to the client or another identifiable person. We've taken out the term identifiable and just put it in terms of others or other people, because there are a number of states now that actually have in their laws duties to report or duties to protect whether or not the other people are identifiable. So if you look sort of historically, people will look back to the mid 1970s with the Tarasov cases. Those were the first times ever that the court started to recognize that confidentiality is not absolute and that there are occasions when we have duties to third parties, people who aren't in the social work client relationship, when their life or their serious risk to their life or their body is at risk. So that was the first time back in the 1970s. And I think the language was trying to be fairly restrictive, saying that, well, if somebody threatens a specific person, then that duty could be triggered. But if it's not an identifiable person, then what can we do about it, and why should we limit confidentiality? So there was a lot of concern that if we had too many social workers or too many mental health professionals breaching people's confidentiality in order to protect other people, then clients wouldn't come to us. They wouldn't trust us. They wouldn't open up with us. We wouldn't be able to build a positive working relationship with them. Now, I still think it's important that social workers limit the types of disclosures and when that duty to protect or duty to report is triggered. But we've had a number of concerns in recent years where clients or others have made threats, or it's been known that they're posing risks to others, but it isn't necessarily an identifiable other person. So if you were to work with somebody who was being radicalized by ISIS or by another terrorist organization, and you knew that there was a threat to a school, to a public gathering, etc., but you didn't know which school or which specific people at that public gathering would be targeted, under the old framing of this standard, there wouldn't be an exception to confidentiality. So here you need to use your discretion in terms of what triggers that duty to report or duty to protect, and what can you do in order to protect and at the same time minimize the breach of confidentiality. So just because there is the risk to another person of serious imminent harm, you may not need to disclose to others. If you are able to use effective crisis management counseling, if you are able to develop a safety plan, if you are able to get the client's permission to share information with the potential victim, then you are not breaching confidentiality. But if the client is posing a risk to others and working with the client in a collaborative way and obtaining consent is not possible, then you have to think about, okay, when can we share information with others, the potential victim, the police, other people in the community, in order to make sure that we're protecting them from serious harm. So that's a change, and everybody's going to have to know state by state what their laws say in terms of, do they have a positive duty, do they have discretion, and when is that discretion even met? So we use the language of serious, foreseeable, and imminent harm. The statutes in different states and the licensing laws may use slightly different language or considerably different language. And one of the exceptions that I would bring up is the state of New Hampshire. I was presenting there and we were talking about imminent harm to the client or others, and somebody said, well, what about property? What about buildings? And I said, well, I don't know of any legal responsibility to protect buildings from imminent harm. Well, we looked in their state laws, and it was actually built into their state laws. So I think that's one of the things that we have to, be aware of, is that there's different legal duties, and that affects also what our ethical responsibilities are. And you'd ask, what would be different now than in the past, not just in terms of the code of ethics, but just in terms of our practice, is there are far more social workers who are practicing across borders. And so if you're going to practice across different state lines, you need to know what the laws are, not just the licensing laws, but child protection laws and laws like what are the responsibilities of social workers and mental health professionals when there is serious foreseeable and imminent harm to the clients, others, or even to property.
This is a really good point, and we know that you're not, that social workers are not allowed to practice in other states where they're not licensed, and I know that that's something that has come up a lot with online practice. And you bring up a compelling reason why social workers should think twice before saying, it'll be fine, because there are this complex tangle of laws that can vary state by state, and things like protecting property. Like, it's not something I've ever thought of. But like you said, if it's in New Hampshire and you're practicing in Vermont and you don't know that, then you're not meeting your professional responsibilities to understand the laws in that state.
Right. Having moved to Florida, Florida is sort of an oddball state compared to some of the others. For instance, the courts here have decided the opposite of Tarasoff. The courts here, there's still a notion of illegitimacy of children for some purposes, and if a child is born out of wedlock, then the father is not required to be contacted for consent if there's going to be an adoption. So, how would you know that unless you really studied the laws in those particular states? I did want to clarify something that you said about social workers not being allowed to practice across state lines. So there's a big "it depends." So we're not allowed to practice across state lines in terms of types of services that require licensure, but we can practice across state lines if there is no requirement for licensure or no restricted practice. So lots of macro practice goes across state lines, and there's no requirement for licensure in each and every state that you are practicing. You could provide coaching services, you could provide counseling that doesn't amount to therapy, you could do basic psychosocial assessments, but you could not do diagnoses. But if you look at 1.04e, that's one of the additions. You need to know the laws of the jurisdiction in which you are present, and also the laws of the jurisdiction where the client is located.
Hey there, podcast listeners. It's me again. Did you enjoy it? Good. Well, if you haven't already listened to part 1, please do that. And don't forget to listen to part 3. Part 1 is an overview and history of the NASW Code of Ethics and a discussion of Section 1.03i, searching for the web for information about your clients. In Part 3, Episode 115, Allan and I talk about Section 1.06g, professional affiliations, and the removal of the word disability. We talk about 1.15, which is disruptions in electronic communications, and we end Part 3 with a discussion of resources for folks who want to learn more about the NASW Code of Ethics and ethical issues in social work practice. All right, I'm done. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.